Awesome. Let's go ahead and get started. Thank y'all so much for coming. This is a huge group, and y'all are in for a treat tonight. Isabella Tarasova is reading from her novel, Unconditional. I am really impressed with Isabella's work, really over the last 2 years, but especially this year. This has been a tremendous undertaking, and I'm so impressed with the outcome. As I told Isabella this, when I finished reading her piece, I had to go take a 10-minute break because it was heavy and it asked me and demanded that I ask myself very difficult questions about what it means to be a mother, what it means to love, and what it means to be a part of a family unit and a part of the world. And I had to stop and give myself that time before I could go on and grade more papers. Y'all are all glad for that. Okay, awesome. So Isabella, I think you can take it from here.
Hello, my name is Isabella Tarasova, and today I will be presenting my novella. So, influences of this project are some of my favorite novels. The first one is The Silence of the Lambs. Thomas Harris, whenever I think about writing, I think about the connection to the antagonist. I think about getting into the mind of your characters and creating a world where you have to have a logical storyline and things need to flow, so you're drawing on real life experiences. A series of unfortunate events was a childhood favorite of mine. I really loved how the main character was like this really weird, creepy dude who kind of followed her around and tried to kill them, and they were kids. So I think for this piece in particular, having children to kind of think about in the realm of horror was interesting because they often don't know the difference between reality and fantasy. So as you're growing up, you see those differences. So in my main character, I kind of wanted to draw on that. And then the last one is Brave Story, which is beautiful. For this one, I really wanted to focus on its world building. It uses a lot of beautiful language, and again, when I was younger, I read this piece. And then other influences were life experiences. So my parents divorced, so been through the ringer. I have my siblings' experiences. I have my mom's, my father's, my stepfather's, and then everyone else you meet. Someone has a divorce experience. So I wanted to tie in a lot of realistic aspects into my work. So goals and purpose. The purpose of this was to create a horror narrative based on fears cultivated during divorce. I'm focusing on themes such as manipulation, possessiveness, sacrifice, love, and underlying family dynamics. And then whenever I write, I think about creating beautiful lines of language with not so beautiful events. I really love juxtaposition and contrast, so you can take a moment and experience it and then process it. So for this presentation, I'm going to be reading a couple excerpts that I have pieced together to either paraphrase or just a portion from my book. So I'm going to take a sip of water, and without further ado, I'm going to read my short novel. So the first portion is called Missing Son. Chris, where is my son? Miranda glared at her husband, forcing her breath through the rage building in her throat. Chris's face was devoid of color. His eyes seemed to slosh around in red, watery sockets. His stubble sank into his graying skin that looked like an expired steak. He stood in the living room by the sofa, quivering as he stared at his face. God damn it, Chris, where is Hunter? Miranda's hand slammed into the table, making him jump and fall onto the floor. His body folded as though he bled through the crusted, messy scab that was his weak facade. I left him. What? I brought him to the swamp. You what? Chris covered his face with his hands and curled into a ball on the floor. His voice shook as he broke out. I left my son in the swamp. Retrieve the body. Help me, please. Hunter softly cried as he laid on top of his bed of Spanish moss and clutched his knees into his chest. Please. So overwhelmed by pain and grief, Hunter did not hear the sound of the motor approaching his bank. A floodlight passed over the surface and stopped on the shaky boy. Chris felt his heart stop. It was Hunter. It was really his boy. He cut the engine and stood in disbelief. Raising a shaky hand to his hollowed-out face, he felt tears gush from his eyes. His words were drenched in saliva, but he forced them out. Hunter, my boy, Hunter! The little boy did not move. Chris fell out of his boat and tripped over himself as he ran through the sand. Sobbing, overjoyed, and worried, he called out for his son. Hunter! Hunter! Hunter heard a faint yell coming from the shore. How many nights had he had the same dream? How many prayers were filled by the desperate hope that someone would rescue him and carry him home? Or better yet, carry him, his mother, and Nellie somewhere far away. Somewhere where he, Hunter, please, my son, my son! A tear fell from Hunter's eyes as he pulled his knees in closer. He wished that the yelling was real. Chris slid to the boy's side and shook his shoulder. Hunter gasped and jumped from his father. Chris almost stopped breathing when he felt how hot his skinned son was and saw the infected bug bites. My boy, Hunter, I'm so sorry. Dear Lord, Mother of Mary, I'm so happy I found you. My boy, let's go home. Chris scooped up the little body and carefully walked towards the boat. I'm so sorry. With the last swell of breath in his lungs, Hunter looked up at his dad and stared into his eyes. I'm not sorry. Christopher stopped. The body grew heavier and heavier in his arms. What was that, my boy? Chris felt himself sink deeper into the muddy sand. He bared his teeth against the growing weight and chill lurking in his limbs. You are my son. We are both sorry. We both forgive one another. Speak up. Didn't I raise you better? He pinched the boy's lips open and shook his face. Huh? You want to repeat what you just told me? He stopped, cut off by the pressure crushing his lungs. You can't die. I won't let you die. Stay with me. Stay with me. Chris stumbled onto the ground, clutching the boy to his chest. He cursed the world for pushing his son to his death. The stars sat in the sky, glimmering in teary splendor. The brilliance of their light reflected onto the murky river and bounced on the ripples in mockery. Chris staggered to his feet and howled at the sky. He's mine. You won't take him. You'll never have him. He's mine. The baby screamed from her crib. The dark little room hid the monsters rampaging the night. It concealed the realities of mourning and hid the bodies that were lost and mourned. Miranda stood over the crib and picked up the babe, whispering and cooing in the soft first glow of the rising sun. The mother held her child to her chest and bounced her. Shh, my love. She kissed the baby's head and gently nuzzled her cheek to the child's. Nellie, it's all right. It's all right. A tear purled under her eye and slowly fell down her cheek. Hunter. Miranda held the baby's head closer to her chest. She inhaled her sweet smell. It warmed her as though just the proximity of her child gave her life, as though this was her life, her person, her responsibility. She never intended to have children, at least not with him. Christopher was supposed to have been temporary. Miranda didn't know how, excuse me, miss, where is the nearest 7-Eleven, turned into, will you marry me? The longing joy of reminiscence began to consume her mind, and she felt tears drop from her cheeks, raised in a smile. What happened? No, Christopher was not who she envisioned for herself, but bitter stabs from her memory made her wince as she realized that he used to be. Miranda sighed as she sat Nellie back into her crib and pushed her fingers to her forehead. He stood in a patch of sunlight amidst the dirty road abused by cars and impatience. Miranda watched the man as he stood on the bridge, staring off into the distance, the wind tossing dark hair that threatened to get into his eyes. As she walked closer to the edge of the bridge, she could already see his struggle and hear the scratchiness of his throat that must be parched from his day in the blue-collar workforce. She did not know why she stopped, why she didn't keep walking. Miranda found herself leaning against the railing, alternating her attention between the river and the stranger. She woke up in his arms. The sun peeked in through the blinds and melted onto his chest. Afraid to move her head and wake him, she looked up with her eyes, searching for his face. He smiled in his sleep. Her heart fluttered as she yawned and gently pushed herself up. His deep brown eyes slowly opened and looked up at her. Not just at her, but into her. He saw her, recognized her innermost fears and desires, gazed at every crevice of her mind and curve of her body. Was it a spiritual tug tying them together? or was it a warning? Her heart was aflame in her chest. He smiled and rubbed his face. Gently placing the back of his hand on hers, the tips of her finger melted into the crevices of his hand. "Let me take you to breakfast." The pair smiled at each other, and as Miranda bent down to kiss him, she hovered over his mouth and their lips softly brushed as she whispered, "Okay." So, I'm going to paraphrase this next scene. Nellie is walking to school, and the air is just sad. It's when you're looking around and everything is so heavy, and you're just trying to brush past the humidity. And as she's crossing the street, she's punched in the side and she's spins sideways. And she goes, "Hey, watch it." The tall man trudged on without turning back. His jeans were low and baggy, starkly contrasting his formal black felt trench coat that failed to cover his navy Nike tennis shoes. His black hair kept tight to the sides, but flipped out in longer sections at the top. His walk was heavy and cumbersome, yet purposeful, as if he was fighting the world, just daring someone to come up to him, and Nellie only stood in the crosswalk for one more beat, to wait to see if the stranger would turn to apologize, but they charged forward. She shook her head and jogged to the other side of the street. So if you fast forward a little bit, she goes through school, and then she walks to the restaurant that her mother works at. So whenever she's sitting at the bar, her mom comes, and she says, "Here you go, my girl." Miranda placed the steaming bowl of noodles in front of Nellie, and she smiled as they danced in the broth. Warmth from the soup created a gate between Nellie and the bitter melancholy night. The world raced by as people hurried to their homes. Headlights gleamed in the growing gloom. Heads ducked down as people drudged across the street and tried to retreat from the ever-fattening raindrops. A woman pulled her coat tightly around her waist and shivered as she drew a fuzzy scarf from her bag. Her wallet fell onto the ground and, unbeknownst to her, remained on the sidewalk as she darted across the street. A current of rainwater pulled the wallet into its channel and carried it into the sewer curate. No pickpockets or thieves claimed the reward of this woman's folly. Instead, her fortune was stolen by the elements and appropriated by the filth and darkness of the underground world. Inside the little restaurant, Miranda hugged Nellie around her shoulders and sat down at the bar beside her daughter with her own bowl of noodles. The cooler's low hum in the background tickled the air's comparative stillness. Miranda and Nellie giggled as they drew faces in the condensation formed by their steaming soup and the frigid window. The building was dark except for the glow from appliances and light pooling from the drink cooler. The concrete floor should have been sticky and covered in crumbs. The pair should be scampering home, like everyone else in the increasingly ravenous night, or so the man thought. He sat in the parking lot overlooking the restaurant and slouched in the front seat of his low-riding, mostly brown car. A roach ran across his foot and hurried back into its home within the car. The man's chest heaved as he choked on cigarette smoke and mucus. The corners of his mouth pinched into a frown, and he quickly rolled down the window to split the gob onto the pavement. He wiped his mouth onto his sleeve and stared at the back door. He memorized where the yellow paint peeled, and the shape of the vines clawing their way across made their way through the walls. Their cars still sat in the rock-filled parking lot, but the building was dark and devoid of movement. Maybe they left through the front door, and I missed seeing them walk to a nearby restaurant. They sometimes did that. Would it be worth going to go check? No. Regardless, they will have to return to their car to go home. Stolen contact. "Hey babe, can I call you back? I'm putting Nels to bed." "Yeah, we just got home." "Okay. I miss you too. I'll call you in a bit." "Okay, alright. Love you too. Bye." Miranda set her phone on the counter and tried to massage the smile out of her cheeks. She walked down the little hallway to Nellie's room. They had a small 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom house in a sleepy suburb. Miranda bought the house last year, and little signs of continuous home improvement hid in corners. The first thing Miranda did to the house was paint the walls white to signify her fresh start, the clean slate. Neat piles of paper, mail, and bills always sat on the kitchen table. Random leftovers and takeout boxes took over the fridge, and the closets were filled to the brim with long-abandoned princess costumes. For the majority of Nellie's life, home was an ever-changing single apartment. When Miranda bought this house, it was a big deal for both of them. It had just been the two of them for so many years. Miranda never intended to remain single for so long, but living on her own was safe. It was predictable and reliable, and she never had to worry about the dreams that swirled and caused her waking days to be nightmares. The endangerment of her children and the vulnerability of being attached to another person. She was grateful that solitude allowed her to evade the painful waiting period where layers of facade are worn away until the ugliness of the man behind the ploy is naked and aggressive in the searing lights of day. Miranda shuddered. Is it safe to even think about bringing in another person? Can I risk it? Blogs and articles flashed in her head, warning her, hinting at green and red lights. How do I know that this relationship is serious enough? How do I protect my daughter? Nellie sat up in bed with a book when Miranda rounded the corner into her room. Good night, sweet girl. Nellie set her book on her lap and looked at her mother, reaching out for a hug. Miranda scooped Nellie into her embrace, and the pair toppled to the side, giggling. Good night, Mama. Sweet dreams. Sweet dreams, baby. Miranda pulled the lilac duvet cover over Nellie's arms and walked over to the door. See you in the morning. Love you, Nellie yawned and turned her head. I love you too. Miranda flipped down the light switch and softly shut the door. As she walked back to the kitchen, she heard soft thumps and felt movement ripple down the laminate wooden flooring. The hall was too dark to reveal shadows and too short to hide in, yet the distance to turn around and hide in another room was too great to do without drawing attention. She stood in the hallway, trying to slow her breathing, yet feeling herself getting swept under the current of terror and suffocated in the limbo of fear. She slowly crept down the hall towards the kitchen. She felt the floor ripple, and she pressed her body against the wall, listening into the other room. Silence. No more movement, no more sounds. She stood there and waited, thinking about her daughter sleeping in the next room, thinking about how there was no way in hell she would allow the intruder, if there even was an intruder, to get to her daughter. Maybe she was being paranoid. She stood still. The room echoed with the pounding of her heart. Car horns sounded groggy and annoyed at still being awake. The AC unit churned and growled a low hum. Her eyes refused to shut. Okay. One foot shakily reached out in front of her, followed by another step that begged and pleaded for her to turn around. She took another deep breath and paused to listen, too scared to release the air she was growing dizzy from holding in. She inched forward. Miranda stood at the edge of the hallway and gripped the edge of the entrance trim. She stared at the white doors to the pantry and watched for shadows. There can't be anyone here. He doesn't know where we are, and why would anyone choose this house out of a sprawl of large homes? I'm just being paranoid. I'm going to walk into the kitchen in 1, 2, 3. Miranda pushed herself into the doorway and sprinted to the knives in the knife holder by the pantry. But the kitchen was empty. Her piles were still neatly stacked on the table. The window was closed. There weren't any tracks on the floor. Miranda felt her chest finally move as relief washed over her body. She walked across the small kitchen to the corner of the stove and picked up her phone. Leaning against the cabinet, she unlocked it and saw Frank's contact card glowing at her face. She smiled to herself at the sight of his name, his familiar phone number, the way she could hear his laugh and feel his arms around her. She pressed the tiny call button and raised the phone to her ear. Hello? Hey, Nels is all tucked in. I'm so sorry I took so long. No, it's all right. Is everything okay? Yeah, everything is fine. It's the funniest story. Remind me to tell you later. All right, Frank laughed. How was your day? The man looked at the numbers scratched onto his piece of paper under the reading light in the front of his car. He traced each figure with his finger and slowly mouthed, Frank. Chris and Frank. So in this scene, it's formatted like a text message. So this is like a writing right now. I miss you. God, there's so much going on. I really need to see you. Please, I'm losing it. Where are you? I'll get there as soon as possible. I'm at the lakefront in the parking lot across from the playground. I almost drove off the road. Jesus, I'm so shaky. Frank, there was someone in my house. I need you. Hurry. Miranda, stay there. I'll be right over. I'm going to call you. Talk to me. I can't talk right now. Please just hurry. Frank's headlights were gelatinous in the fog, and the road was obstructed by mist and gloom. The meager glow from the analog time on his car stung the air and transformed precious seconds into elusive currents of sand, carried into the wind and thrown into his eyes. He stepped a little harder on the gas, and his hands tightened around the steering wheel. Sweat coated his palms. He stared at the road, intent to get to Miranda as soon as possible. He looked down at his phone and saw 3 missed messages. "Where are you? Please, baby, I need you." Frank searched for the playground and tried to call Miranda. He was sent straight to voicemail. Pulling into the parking lot, he didn't see Miranda's car. He opened his messages, worried and uneasy. "I'm here. Where are you?" "Thank God, I see you." There was a soft tap on his window. He unlocked his doors and waited for her to go to the passenger side, but she stood still by his door. He could only imagine the tears pooling down her beautiful face, her shaky body. She must be so cold. Even though he could not see her face, he traced the outline of her slim figure. She moved slowly as he opened the door. He stepped out of the car and rushed to embrace her in his arms. "You don't have to tell me what's wrong, but I'm here for you. I will find out who broke into your house. Jesus Christ, you had me so worried." A shadow crossed the woman and crashed into Frank's cheek. His head screamed as his brain thrashed inside his skull and his vision grew blurry under the water, glazing his eyes. Frank stumbled back and grabbed his aching jaw. He looked back towards Miranda and saw her figure become eclipsed by a large, muscled stature lumbering towards him with balled fists. An unfamiliar female voice cried from behind the man. "Baby, don't do this. Come on, let's just leave." Frank felt his stomach drop. "Shut up," the man roared over his shoulder. "Where's Miranda?" Frank yelled, fist tightening as he planted his feet into the ground. The man laughed. The figure cocked his head to the side, the moonlight glared behind him. The lake was obstructed by the jagged silhouettes of oak trees, and the playground sat ominously in the background. "Baby, I miss you. I need you. I need you." The man cooed in falsetto. "You're right. She doesn't need you. Here's what you need." The man charged at Frank and aimed for his liver. Frank stepped out of the way and sprinted towards his car. The man roared and tackled Frank to the ground. Before he could pin him down, Frank laced his hands around the man's neck and reared his nose down into his knee. The man fell off of him and grabbed at the spray of blood rushing from his abstracted nose. The woman screamed and ran to him. She rubbed his arms. "Baby, baby, are you okay?" The man groaned and shoved the woman off of him. Frank sprinted to his car and started the engine. Something jolted the back of his vehicle, and he saw the man in his rearview mirror. His face was red against the black backup lights. Black hair was spiked and too tight for his head. His jaw was sharp and his cheekbones hugged his eyes. But his nose was caved in, and the rest of the man's face was obstructed under a bloody mask. He roared and brought his fist down upon the rear window. The glass cracked under the blow. As the man raised his fist again, Frank revved his engine as a warning. Unfazed, the man splintered the glass. Frank put the car in reverse and floored it. He saw the figure lurch out of the way and stumble to the side of the car. As Frank turned out of the parking lot, the man screamed and charged after him. His fist shattered the passenger side mirror and he howled in pain, clutching his bloody fist to his chest. Frank's headlights illuminated the parking lot and he saw the woman laying face down on the pavement. He had half a mind to go ask her if she was okay, but he saw the man start to run after the car. Frank locked the doors and tore out of the lot. The man sprinted after him before Frank heard a final roar and glared into his rearview mirror. The man was solid in the middle of the street and stared at the back of the car. He was a silhouette against the brilliant moon, a shadow drop poured into the shape of a man. As the man turned his head, moonlight illuminated his cheekbones and lit his evil eyes. Frank hoped that either the truth would leak into the morning, or the man would be irrevocably absorbed into the night. Frank prayed that Miranda was all right. Who was this man? Okay. So this next section is called manipulation, and I'm going to sum it up and then give the next scene. So while Nellie sits in class, she's thinking about Topher's injuries. So over the span of like a week, they have been meeting at this coffee shop and talking, getting to know each other. And so as she's having a flashback to their conversation, she remembers how he tried to play everything off like nothing happens. And then he tells Nellie the story of his attack. He explains that he received a panic call from his girlfriend, and when he rushed over to her, it was actually a setup. His girlfriend Daria had a secret lover waiting for him and nearly beat him to death. Topher is what Nellie calls him. It reveals that Daria has trapped him in their relationship, and he is worried about his son's life now that Daria is alone with him. He uses this story to make Nellie feel sorry for him and to cover up the fact that he was the man who tried to kill Frank that night in the parking lot. Desperate to spend time with Nellie, he uses the story to convince her that he needs her help to murder Daria. So after he picks Nellie up from school, they stop to eat. And the whole time, Nellie's like, oh my gosh, this guy just asked me to kill someone, but I have to. So Miranda receives a call from one of her friends who works at the restaurant, and she rushes over to confront Chris. And in this scene, Nellie learns that Chris, who told her his name was Topher, is actually Christopher, and it's her father. So Miranda takes Nellie home, and the next scene is when Christopher gets back home. This one is called Lies. Christopher sat on the couch. Babe, it's not good. She knows. They both know. Daria laid motionless on the floor, her body sinking into the carpet. Chris knew she must be exhausted. He told her that he was bringing Nellie to the house right after school, but food took longer than expected. The scene with Miranda exploded. Things were a mess. Babe, I think they might call the cops. Daria groaned. Miranda, what should we do about her? Sure, she made a scene at the restaurant, but that's just like her, all show and no action. I don't think she'll call the cops. And we taught Frank not to meddle in our business, so I think we're good there too. Chris laughed. He thought of Hunter sleeping in his room. Chris felt bad for him not being around this week, and he was looking forward to making it up to his son. After tucking the boy in, he decided that he'd take him to the football game in the stadium this weekend, surprise him with a jersey and tickets. He'll buy his son any snack he wants. They will cheer and high five as the quarterback runs to make a touchdown. His son will forgive him. Babe, do you want to go see the game this weekend? The woman let out a sigh. That's all right. I understand you're needing your rest. I'm going to take Hunter out. I feel bad, especially because his sister should be right here now. He'll forgive me, though, when I bring them both to the game. Chris sighed. All right, babe. I'm going to make a phone call. And honey, I'm not mad. I forgive you. But look, you see, you really hurt me. I think we just need to take a second. Chris walked down the hall and raised his phone to his ear. Daria laid helpless on the floor as she watched the world grow fuzzy. A single tear fell down her cheek and she shivered. A pool of blood flowed around her body and became sticky, like mortar between the carpet and her flesh. Chris laughed in the distance. Yes, sir. Just wait until you meet my kids. They're my world. Nellie. You lied. You said my father was dead. Little girl, you don't understand anything. You want to feel sorry for him? Miranda laughed. Go ahead. But everything I have ever done is to protect you, you ungrateful, privileged brat. All I have cared about was giving you the childhood your brother couldn't have. You know nothing. Then tell me. Miranda quivered as she chewed on her lip. Okay. Miranda screamed as he jerked her hair and forced her ear to his mouth. Whenever I see the first sign of that bump, I'm going to beat the ever-loving crap out of you. Miranda hiccuped against the sobs filling her chest. When the baby comes out, a miserable clump of flesh and blood, I'm going to rip it apart and paint your whole body in its blood. Chris threw her head against the mattress and staggered out of their bedroom. Clean up this mess. Miranda sobbed into the mattress, losing track of time until she regained her breath. No more. Miranda tiptoed out of her bedroom. She wiped the blood from her mouth and sweat from her upper lip as she stared into the kitchen. Where is he? The room was startled by the sickly sound of his inhalation, fighting snot and mucus. Miranda nodded. The living room. Chris was on the couch. His head was knocked back and he gripped a bottle of water in his left. He bolted the front door of the couch. Tears formed in Miranda's eyes. All of the other doors were bolted shut. God damn it! She pressed her face into the wall, willing its coolness to soothe her hot tears. Her entire body ached and swayed underneath her. Bruised and bleeding, she could hardly stand. She punched the wall and slowly walked to Hunter's old room. She couldn't make it past the doorway. His precious baseball sheets were still torn off the sides of the unmade bed, his homework laid on his desk half done and dated almost a week ago. It had been almost a week. Dear God. She sobbed into her hands and squeezed her eyes together, begging them to change the scene when they opened again, willing herself to see something other than the nightmare plaguing her life. Please, she whispered. Nellie slept softly in her crib. In a daze, Miranda stood in the doorway. She inhaled sharply, and when she opened her eyes, she was not relieved to see that everything had just been in her mind, but really saw things. Her spine straightened and her nails cut into the wall. No more. She searched her drawers and pulled out a wad of bills hidden in one of her socks. Shoving the money into her bra, she ran to the bathroom and tucked away her mother's jewelry. She caught her reflection and jumped. Her eyes were alive, livid, her face set back to a primal expression that warned the world to stay back. Let us get ravaged by her desperation. Someone might die. The baby's window was the only one not chained and bolted. The baby bag was packed. The valuables were stuffed into its pockets. Food would have to be found. They had to leave, and they had to leave now. Miranda pressed her face into the wall. She shivered. Could she do this? She knew that if she failed, dear God, she could not fail. She collapsed onto the floor and shoved one of Nellie's onesies into her mouth to suffocate her screams. Through her tears, she saw her child's crib. She saw the open window. No more. Pushing herself off the floor, she strode over to the window and slowly lifted it just enough to climb through. Swinging the bag over her shoulders, she walked to Nellie's crib and scooped up the baby. Nellie softly cried, and Miranda hushed her and kissed her head. The baby quietly reached out for Miranda. She gave her a binky and strapped her to their chest, and carefully, they moved through the window and landed on the damp grass. We've been running ever since. Miranda stared at Nellie. Mama, shh, shh. We have to be strong right now. Miranda swooped Nellie into her embrace, and the pair cried on each other's heads. Nellie could not stop thinking about Chris. How could he be the same man in her mother's story? How Topher Chris was a man who knew suffering. He had been beaten by the world and forced to crawl his way to whatever refuge his dying, damned body could arrive to. He relied on the kindness of strangers, receiving cruelty and abuse instead. He had a son, a girlfriend who cheated and tried to kill him, and a daughter that was taken away from him when she was only a baby. Nellie pushed her mother away and hung her head. Miranda stared at her, hurt. Why do you keep lying to me? Miranda stared at her breathless. What? Why do you keep lying? Why don't you want me to know my dad? Nels, no. You're tired. Today was a lot. Shut up, Nellie. I hate you. The next section is called Dying. So this moment is a flashback to when Hunter was in the swamp, and Chris and Miranda are talking. He's gone. I buried him on the shore. The words crashed into Miranda as she felt herself plummet from any tangibility of reality. He was eaten alive by some animal. I couldn't show you that. No, no, no. She was underwater. The words were murmurs that mercilessly swept into the raptures of her thoughts. She felt pressure on her shoulder and turned to see Chris's hand. Are you listening to me? Take me to him, she whispered. What? Take me to him. They stood at a mound of sand. Chris warned her that the boy had been in pieces, that the grave was a soup of blood and sand, but she had half the mind to dig into the earth and let it consume her and her child together. Hunter, her baby. Oh dear God, she fell to the ground and threw sand onto her body. How could you? You did this, you killed our child. She stared at the grave in despair. Jesus Christ, my sweet Hunter, no, no. She lost herself in the force of her wails and sobs. How could you? Chris stared at her and shadows engulfed his face as he cocked to the side. Well, are you going to answer me? He stood still as though he were solidified in the moonlight. Staring at her, fascinated by her despair, studying the scent of her panic, testing to see how far she would go. The corners of his mouth turned up slightly as tears trickled and grew into a rapid that ravaged Miranda's face. You're so cute when you get all worked up. Miranda felt the world stop. What did you just say? Christopher slowly walked towards her as his footprints trailed in the shadowy sand. His bulging eyes were cradled in his ever-sinking red sockets. He stared at her and smiled. Why don't you yell some more? I want to hear you scream. I want you to scream so loud our dead son will crawl out of his grave to tell you to shut up. Get away from me! Get away! Miranda picked up a handful of sand and rocks and flung it into Chris's eyes. Chris laughed and wiped his face with one of his huge forearms. So it's gonna be that way. Miranda turned on her heels and sprinted down the beach. She frantically looked around for some way to escape, something to fight with, but her mind was devoid of any other thought than run. Her back arched as the wind was knocked out of her chest. Collapsing onto the ground, she cried out as her legs were pinned. Chris kneeled on her thighs and grabbed a handful of her hair. He pulled her head up and whispered in her ear, "You aren't going anywhere." Miranda sobbed heavily and saliva collected on the edges of her mouth. "Please, let me go. I'll do whatever. I won't tell anyone. We can go off and live our separate lives. Just let me." Chris yanked her hair, throwing her head back. "Separate lives." "Oh no, babe. You are mine." He lunged forward. Miranda gasped for air. Immense weight crushed her chest, forcing her ribs to retreat out to the sides, sucking the air out of her body. The walls of her throat were concave as though she were being vacuum sealed. Her eyes swelled. Panic, etched in the ancient recesses of her reptilian mind, screamed at her to move, to breathe, to do something. Miranda screamed and thrashed her limbs, desperate to escape. Thoughts ricocheted in her mind until she was drowning under the waves of their echo. The world began to twinkle out of view. One name, one word, Nellie. She pushed against the force with her entire body. The weight slid off of her and landed next to her with a thud. Air rushed into her body and stung as it streamed into her lungs. She drowsily turned her head. Her stomach dropped. She was nose to nose with a woman staring back at her. Her glassy eyes were covered in a sickly film and her mouth gaped open. Blonde hair crusted in blood stuck to the edges of her face, but something was wrong with her forehead. It looked peeled and bruised, even in the dark room. Miranda felt her arm reach back towards the lamp, and as she stared at the body in horrid transfixion, the light rushed into the room, and Miranda saw it. Carved in letters barely legible from severed flesh and blue-purple skin was a single word, mine. The baseball posters were underlit by the singular lamp on the oak bedside table. Nellie looked across the room and saw a window on the opposite wall. She slid past the door and softly shut behind her. So in this scene, Chris took Nellie to his house and she's trying to run from him, find any way to escape, and she finds this room at the end of the hallway, and that's where she is right now. Slowly peeling from the door, she scanned the room. The bed frame matched the lightwood side table and was covered in a puffy, faded blanket with a retro baseball video game. As her eyes traveled up the bed, her gaze climbed the large mound under the blanket. She had completely forgotten about his son. She held her breath and tiptoed to the window. Digging her fingers under the edge, she looked over her shoulder at the boy, while she slowly pushed upwards. Her hands fought against the window, but it refused to slide open. She stared at it, dug her feet into the ground, and pushed up as hard as she could, beginning to whine as the force of her attempt squeezed the air from her lungs. She stumbled back and gasped for air. No, no, no. She rushed to the window and pushed up the edges of her hands like angry teeth forced her to let go. She wiped the cold sweat from her forearm and tried to shake out her hands, willing herself to stay standing, remain calm, but she knew it was over. Unless it would be a long shot. But she'd have to try to convince him to help her. She looked at the door and sighed when she saw it was still closed. She tapped on the boy under the blanket. "Hey, boy," she whispered and gently shook his shoulder. Something was wrong. As Nellie stood by the body, the increasing weight in her stomach was now undeniable, and she knew she couldn't brush it off as worrying that Christopher might spring up behind her. This was different. She shook the body a little harder. The meaty smell from earlier passed by like a gust of wind, yet it clung to the air, depositing the stench of rotting fish and decaying rats. She desperately needed air and felt panic begin to seep into her brain, begging her to break the window. Hey! She shook the boy more vigorously, but recoiled as the smell slammed into her nostrils. She dug her head under her shirt and crept towards him. She couldn't wait any longer. He needed to wake up, and she needed to get out of here. Nellie ripped off his blanket and felt her skin fry and peel back like a blistering onion skin on a skillet filled with oil. The skin, even though it didn't look like skin but had to be skin, stretched tightly over the dehydrated body in patches of discoloration mingled with bare bone and flaky edges. The bed was littered with his skin crumbles. The lipless face bared its teeth and stared at Nellie with eyeless, socketless eyes. The flesh pulled around his cheekbones was purple and orange, flecked with mold spores and mucus-like growths. His head rotted into a pillow, and now the flesh and fabric were inseparable. Stitches lined the sides of his skull and crude wires mutilated his miserable body. He was missing an arm, and his legs looked like rotting limbs ending at ankles that had makeshift metal feet made out of old signposts. His nose was all but gone. The socket seemed to deepen as Nellie stared into his face. She felt as though they were hypnotizing her, drawing her in and stealing her soul, like vacuums or sinkholes, concrete yet mercilessly and apathetically ripping at anything in their vicinity. And Nellie wanted to be swallowed. His teeth began to move. I've been waiting to meet you. Nellie screamed and flung herself from the bed. Ripping her eyes from the body, she begged herself to see anything else, hear anything else, breathe through the suffocating terror and vomit mixing in her stomach. Christopher leaned in the doorway, his face glistening with fresh tears that gently watered his smile. My beautiful babies, finally together. Together. Nellie, say hello to your brother, Hunter. What? The body laid on the bed. Chris, Dad, Hunter doesn't look like he's doing too well. Don't be rude. He's been so excited to meet you. I've been telling him all about you, and Miranda will be here soon. His voice sounded like a little boy's, starkly contrasting his huge shoulders and lumbering muscles. Dad, Hunter is dead. No, that's what I told your mom, but that's only because I was mad with her. No, look, here he is, Hunter, your brother. Come on. Chris speed-walked to Nellie and grabbed her wrist, crushing her hand as he dragged her back to the bed. Come talk to your brother. He gently prodded Hunter's hand from the mattress and pulled Nellie towards him. She felt her face fall, the bell alarm ringing with sirens of terror. No. As though he didn't notice her struggle to pull away, he pushed her hand into the rigid, leathery palm of her dead brother. Chris looked at their hands and frowned. Sit down on the bed with your brother. Tears sprung from her eyes and she fought to keep them in. Stop crying. Wipe your goddamn face before you get him wet. Chris threw Nellie from the bed and rushed to her spot. Reaching under the bed, he grabbed a towel and furiously dried where she sat. He intensely scanned Hunter and tenderly dabbed spots on his face. He placed his hand over his heart and breathed deeply. Running his hand over his disheveled hair, he turned back to Nellie with a wide grin. We have to be careful with your brother, sweetie. He doesn't like water. Now come back here, come on. We aren't angry. He fanned his hand and motioned her over. Nellie felt as though her body were shutting down and she just stared back. The smile dropped from Christopher's face. Come here. That look was back in his eyes. It said, get over here or I'll make you. Nellie cautiously approached Chris. The smile reappeared. See, Hunter, I told you she was a good girl. He wiped the tears under her eyes with his thumb and brushed her hair out from behind her shoulders. Nellie stiffened and looked into Christopher's eyes, searching for any gleam of sanity. They stared back empty and focused not on reality, but on the world he was projecting. Get in the bed. His hand dug into her shoulder and forced her down. She winced as she sat down on a pile of dead skin and stains. The smell roared. She tilted her head back, begging the tears not to fall. Lay down. Nellie scooted into the bed, careful to avoid Hunter's legs. Christopher brought the blanket up to her shoulders and tucked it around the corpse and Nellie's quivering bodies. The rescue. God. Miranda squinted at the nearly illegible address scribbled on the back of a piece of paper. She tried to pretend it wasn't one of Hunter's baby pictures. On the bottom of the image was a single line. Come meet me and your children. It's time to come home. Miranda sat outside a house with a brown car peeling outside in the driveway. She looked up from the paper to check the address one last time. The lights in the kitchen and upstairs glowed from the windows, and suddenly her fear was dissolved by rage. He took one of my kids. He will not take another. She banged on the door. The locks clicked and slid out of place. Hey, Miranda. His gaze melted over her body and made her feel breezy. Hello, Christopher. Where is my daughter? She did everything she could not to snarl. Chris smiled. Please come in. We've been waiting for you. Miranda walked past him. The door shut behind her. Hunter, Nellie, your mother is home. This way, we were all sitting in the living room. Chris gestured to the right and guided Miranda through the kitchen to the dark room, swimming in the stench of death and dirt. Miranda reminded herself to stay calm as she watched the roaches dive in between couch cushions. She saw two figures sitting with their backs to the kitchen and ran around the couch. Nellie! She stopped. Nellie screamed at her from behind the duct tape binding her mouth with terror-filled eyes. She was bound at the wrist and ankles and was tied to the doll sitting beside her. Oh, sweet Jesus. Miranda's screams filled the living room while Nellie shook her head wildly, pleading for her mother to be quiet. Can I get you something to drink? Chris called from the kitchen. Miranda stumbled back and gagged her screams with her forearm. Nellie's face was hot, red, and coated in tears. Metal scraping on metal sounded in the kitchen. Miranda desperately ran to Nellie and pulled the tape from her mouth and began to untie her arms. My sweet girl, we need to leave now. Whoa, whoa, whoa. What are my girls up to? Miranda whipped around to face him. I'm taking my daughter and we are leaving. Chris frowned. So soon? Yes. He shook his head. Look at how happy our little Hunter is. He missed you. I have missed you. Chris reached out and stroked Miranda's chin. She snapped her head to the side and pushed away from his touch. I don't know why you're still mad at me. Don't you think it's time to put everything aside and come back together to be a family? Chris, what have you done? What do you mean? Oh my God, did you stuff him? Miranda, I don't understand. You killed and then taxidermied his body. No, I didn't. He's right there. He's dead. How could you just give up on him like that? Give up on us. I've watched Nellie grow from afar because you took her from me. All these years we have been running and I have chased. I found you. Isn't that a sign? We are meant to be together. You are mine. Don't you say another word. He looked at her. An abandoned dog refused refuge in a thunderstorm. You will stay away from me and my daughter, or I swear to God I will kill you. Chris grabbed the back of Miranda's neck and jerked his fist full of her hair and flesh towards his face. You belong to me. You are my wife. These are my children. Enough. He threw her to the floor and grabbed the duct tape from the table. He sat on Miranda's legs and bound her. He picked her off the floor and sat her beside Nellie, who stared blankly into space. Sit tight. I'll be back. In this next scene, he goes and he prepared a syringe filled with something to knock her out. So his goal is to taxidermy the mother and the daughter now. And in the scene, Miranda breaks out of the tape. Here we go again. Stop fighting it. He threw a plate against the wall and it shattered inches from Miranda's ear. She screamed and ran back to Nellie. Miranda dove onto the ground and cut the rope around the girl's hands. Keep screaming. Do what you do best, huh? Aren't you tired of all of this? Just sit down and it will all be over. I can give you that. Take all of this away. Give you an immortal life with your children. Get away from me. Nellie, run. Nellie hopped over the couch and sprinted to the door with her mother. Chris laughed from the living room. Miranda frantically turned the lock and kicked off the doorknob. As they ran to the car, they could still hear his wild laughter. The world rode on the wings of a butterfly. As they approached the car, the butterfly furiously beat its wings. Standing became nauseating, objects were obscured. Amidst the swirling background, Nellie saw a butterfly floating above her head and lazily danced down. Her mother squeezed her hands, her love crying into Nellie's fingertips. Run, Nellie. Miranda released Nellie's hands and ran back to the door. The girl blindly ran into the night, chasing the butterfly. Her father's laughter and mother's screams gurgled in the background, a current carrying sobs and repeating rapids of tumultuous sorrow. Christopher staggered in the doorway over Miranda's slumped corpse, stealing the light from inside the house as though his eclipse promised everlasting darkness. "I love you," he whispered as he watched Nellie run away. Dollhouse. Nellie closed her book and stretched. She pushed herself off of the couch and walked to the apartment kitchen. Frank left her breakfast in the fridge before going to work that morning. She didn't mind living with him. He understood that she didn't want to talk about it and recognized the tiny pained smiles that indicated she was thinking about it. She quickly wiped her tears and smiled into the fridge. A Tupperware container full of noodles sat in the center. She smiled at the heart drawn on the sticky note. As she placed the container on the counter, there was a pounding on the door. She jumped, nearly spilling her food onto the floor. Nellie told herself to breathe, and she shakily crept to the door. Pressing her ear against the wall, she listened, until she knew they were gone. The floor vibrated as heavy footsteps rushed down the hall and turned into the stairwell. She stood at the door, unable to move. Gathering what she could, she turned the knob. Something was taped to the door. She closed her eyes and carefully peeled the tape. It was a picture of a young couple and their baby. Nellie stopped. Her heart squeezed, sending sharp pains into her legs. She knew those eyes. It was an old picture of Miranda, Hunter, and Chris, written across the top, "Come home." Thank you. Are there any questions?
Where can we find the whole thing?
Yeah, I can work on that. I might publish this summer.
Is there a part 2?
I might expand it. We'll see. Any other questions? Can't.
How old is Nellie?
So Hunter is around 6 and Nellie is like a little bit older. She's maybe like 10 preteen age. Any other questions?
How long did it take you to write?
That's a crazy question. Okay, so I thought about writing a horror novel on divorce maybe my sophomore year. So the idea was in my brain, but I didn't start working on it until this summer. And so I wrote a completely different plot line, and then December hit, and I was like, no. And so I scratched the whole thing, and I rewrote it again. And really this semester is when it all came together. Any other questions?
What happened to Frank?
So Nellie goes and she lives with Frank. So Frank is fine, they're living together. So that's kind of like her stepfather.
How long is the book like as right now?
As of right now, it's around 49 pages. It's like 22,000 words.
How do you come up with the idea of taxidermy?
Okay. So some people I know are very childish, and I was thinking, all right, how could you keep someone forever? And why would you want to keep them forever? That would be because you're not seeing them as who they are, but what they already do. And so part of the reason I entitled it Unconditional was because he loves his children because they're his children. He sees them as extensions of himself. So taxidermy was a way to symbolize the like, it's not about you. It's about having you and manipulating you for my life. Anything else?